Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at cognitive load theory.
Yeah,
So we've got a whole bunch of sources for this one.
we do.
We've got some excerpts from a presentation. We have a practical guide for teachers about cognitive load theory. We also have a few web pages.
Yeah, some really good ones.
Yeah, and even a clip of John Sweller himself from a conference.
It's going to be a really interesting deep dive. I think there's something in it for everyone, whether you're a student, a teacher,
Yeah, definitely.
or just interested in how the mind works.
Absolutely. And so I thought maybe we could just jump right in.
Let's do it.
One of the things that really stood out to me in the presentation was this idea of biologically primary and secondary knowledge.
Right.
And they talk about this in the 2017 WMC Ignite session.
Yep.
And it just got me thinking about, how easy it is to recognize faces.
Right.
But then some things like, advanced math are so difficult.
Yeah,
Is that connected at all to this primary versus secondary knowledge idea?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So David Geary, who's done a lot of work on this,
Yeah.
he really highlights that almost everything that we formally teach falls under this secondary knowledge category,
Okay.
which basically means it's built upon these cultural systems rather than just instincts.
So like reading,
Yeah, reading, writing, history,
math.
math, all of
Right.
these things require conscious effort and a lot of practice.
Yeah, and that really resonates because it's like those things that we just do without even thinking about it, like
Uh,
recognizing someone's face
uh-huh.
versus the things we had to really, grind away at in school.
Right.
And speaking of how our brains process information, I thought that diagram on slide 4 of the
Yes.
human memory model was just so simple but so powerful, again, from that same presentation.
Yeah, it's a great visual.
Yeah, and just shows, how information goes from the environment to the short-term memory
Yeah.
and then potentially into long-term memory.
And it really highlights the limitations of our short-term memory.
Yeah.
It has such a limited capacity and duration.
Yeah, we've all had that tip of the tongue experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just can't recall something and it's in there somewhere.
And that diagram really explains why.
It does.
Because you've got to get it from the short-term memory into that long-term memory.
Exactly. And long-term memory is practically limitless, but that short-term memory is a real bottleneck.
Okay, so thinking about, getting things into long-term memory,
Yeah.
the presentation also mentions that like math instruction, the purpose of it is to build that domain specific knowledge
Right.
in the long-term memory.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that. It's not just math, it's anything.
It is anything at all.
It's
History coding,
yeah, if you want to learn a language.
playing a musical instrument.
Yeah. You have to get that stuff into the long-term memory.
Absolutely.
And that's where cognitive load theory comes in.
Right, because cognitive load theory is all about recognizing those limitations of short-term memory.
Working memory,
Yes.
that limited workspace.
Yeah, exactly.
And the sources mentioned there's actually 3 different types of cognitive load. And
Yeah.
some of them are good for learning and some of them are not so good.
That's right.
So can you break those down for us?
Sure. So we've got intrinsic load,
Okay.
which is basically the inherent difficulty of the task itself.
Okay.
Some things are just more complex than others.
Like,
Like if you think about a young child
yeah.
trying to understand fractions,
Right.
that's inherently a very complex concept for them.
Okay, so no matter how you teach it.
Yeah, it's always going to have that high intrinsic load.
Okay.
Then we have extraneous load,
Yeah.
which is all about how the information is presented.
So like a bad worksheet.
A bad worksheet,
Mhm.
a cluttered diagram, a teacher using confusing language.
Right.
All of these things can add extraneous load and make it harder to learn.
Like trying to study in a noisy room.
Exactly.
Yep. With distractions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so going back to our fractions example,
Mhm.
if a teacher is using a poorly designed worksheet or confusing terminology, that's extraneous load on top of that already challenging intrinsic load.
Right. So it's like insult to injury
Exactly.
for that learner's working memory.
Yeah.
And then we have germane load,
Yes.
which is actually the good one.
This is the one we want.
Yeah.
So germane load is the mental effort that actually contributes to learning,
So it's like,
making connections,
yeah.
building schemas, and really engaging with the material.
Okay.
So if we think about our fractions example again, if a teacher is using clear visuals and relatable examples
Uh-huh.
and encouraging students to connect fractions to real-world scenarios,
Yeah.
that's fostering germane load.
So we want to minimize extraneous load
Yes,
and maximize germane load.
as much as possible.
It sounds like a balancing act.
It is a delicate balance.
I'm wondering about some of the specific cognitive load effects,
Yeah,
like the split attention effect.
right.
How does that actually affect learners?
So the split attention effect is a great example of how extraneous cognitive load can really creep in and sabotage learning. So if you imagine a geometry problem
Yeah.
where the diagram is on one page and the written explanation is on a different page,
Right.
the learner has to constantly flip back and forth,
Right.
and that just overloads their working memory.
It's like trying to follow a recipe
And
when
so
the ingredients are in a separate book.
it makes it so much harder.
Yeah. Are there other examples of that?
Yeah, so another really interesting one is the worked example effect.
Okay.
Now, this might sound a little counterintuitive at first,
Okay.
but research has shown that actually showing learners fully worked solutions
Before they even try it.
before they even attempt the problem themselves actually improves learning.
Oh, that's interesting because I would have thought making them struggle through it
You would think so.
would be better.
You'd think so, right?
Yes.
But what happens is when we provide that worked example,
Uh-huh.
we're actually reducing extraneous load.
Okay.
We're freeing up that mental space for them to really focus on the underlying principles and procedures rather than getting bogged down in just figuring out the steps.
So it's like,
It's like providing training wheels for someone learning to ride a bike.
right, they can focus on the balance and the steering without having to worry about falling over.
Exactly.
That's a great analogy. I like that.
So they can focus on those higher level processes.
Yeah. Are there other pitfalls that we should be aware of?
Yes, the redundancy effect.
Okay.
This is a very common one.
Okay.
And it happens when we present the same information in multiple ways,
Okay.
thinking that we're catering to different learning styles.
Right.
But actually, research shows that this can backfire,
Okay.
especially if the information becomes redundant.
Okay.
It's like having someone explain directions to you while
Mhm.
simultaneously showing you a map and then also reading the directions aloud from a GPS device.
Yeah. It's too much.
It just creates cognitive overload.
So a simple diagram with a clear label
You got
is much better than that same diagram with a lengthy text description.
keep it simple.
Yeah, less is more.
Less is more, especially for those novice learners.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about, managing that cognitive load
Mhm.
and getting that information into long-term memory.
Yeah.
But now let's talk about long-term memory in schemas.
Okay. I'm really interested in this. How does that all tie into cognitive load theory?
So basically, building a rich network of knowledge in our long-term memory is key
Huh.
to expertise in any field.
Okay.
And that's where the concept of schemas comes in.
Okay.
So schemas are these mental frameworks
Yeah.
that organize and connect information. They're like our mental filing cabinets
Okay.
that allow us to store and retrieve information efficiently.
So the more you know about a topic,
Uh-huh.
the stronger those schemas are.
Exactly.
Okay.
The more you know about history,
Yeah.
the easier it's going to be to learn new historical facts.
And make connections.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like having a well organized library.
It is.
You can find the book that you need
That's a great way to put it.
because you understand the system.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to see how this all connects together.
Yeah.
We have these limited working memory resources.
Right.
We need to manage that cognitive load
Yeah.
to help learners transfer that information into the long-term memory where
Absolutely.
they can build those schemas.
And become experts.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a pretty fascinating process.
It is a fascinating process.
So we've talked a lot about, building those schemas
Yeah.
and getting that information into long-term memory.
Yeah.
But the sources also really emphasize explicit instruction,
Yes.
especially for beginners.
Especially for novices.
So isn't there a tension there?
Yeah. That's a great point.
Like how do we balance that direct instruction with encouraging learners to be more curious
Right.
and self-directed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a question that a lot of educators are grappling with.
Yeah.
How do we find that balance?
Yeah.
So I think it's helpful to think about it like learning to ride a bike. At first you need those training wheels.
Yeah.
You need someone holding on to you, providing that direct instruction and support.
Yeah.
But eventually the goal is for the learner to ride independently,
Right.
to explore new paths and even take some risks.
That's a great analogy.
So how do we help learners transition from that initial support to becoming more self-directed
Yeah.
and intrinsically motivated to learn?
Yeah.
So I think it's a gradual process
Okay.
of fading the scaffolding,
Yeah.
providing opportunities for exploration and experimentation,
Yeah.
while still offering support when needed.
Okay.
One strategy that can be really helpful is to use what are called completion problems.
Completion problems.
Yeah, so these are problems where learners are given parts of the solution,
Okay.
but they have to fill in the gaps themselves.
So it's like a puzzle.
It is like a puzzle.
Yeah.
It's giving them some pieces, but they have to put the rest together themselves.
So it's guiding them towards the solution,
Yeah,
but letting them make those connections.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But fostering curiosity goes beyond just removing that structure.
it does.
Right. It's
Yeah,
about tapping into that desire to learn and to explore.
absolutely. And, John Sweller himself talks about how biologically, primary knowledge,
Yeah.
those kind of instinctual skills,
Okay.
they're often acquired through exploration and play.
Hmm.
And while we can't exactly replicate those conditions for learning more complex subjects,
Right.
I think we can draw inspiration from it.
Yeah.
So instead of just presenting information in a dry textbook manner,
Yeah.
we can try to make it more engaging and interactive
Okay.
and allow learners to make their own discoveries.
So what would that look like in a practical sense?
So it means designing learning environments that spark curiosity,
Okay.
offering choices, encouraging questions,
Yeah.
and allowing learners to pursue their own lines of inquiry within a structured framework.
So instead of just, you know, lecturing on dates and facts in history.
Right. What if students could choose a historical figure to research in depth and then present their findings in a creative way?
That sounds a lot more interesting than memorizing a timeline.
A lot more engaging.
And I would think that kind of active learning would lead to stronger schema development as well.
Absolutely. The more connections learners make,
Yeah.
the more intrigued they become and the
Yeah.
more motivated they are to learn even more.
But we still need that balance between
Yes, structure,
we don't want to overwhelm them
light.
with too much choice,
Yeah,
especially in the early stages.
especially at the beginning. And
Yeah.
the Cognitive Load Theory Practice Guide
Right.
really emphasizes knowing your students,
Yes.
understanding where they are in their learning journey,
Absolutely.
and adapting your teaching strategies
So important.
to meet their needs.
Yeah.
What works for one learner
Right.
might not work for another.
Exactly.
And that personalized approach can also be applied to fostering curiosity.
One learner might be fascinated by hands-on experiments,
Right.
while another might want to, read research papers.
Exactly.
So it's about providing a variety of options
Yeah.
and letting them discover what sparks their own interest.
Exactly. And that's where technology can play a really exciting role.
Okay.
We have so many resources and tools now that can cater to different learning styles and preferences.
We have interactive simulations,
Yes.
online forums.
Virtual reality experiences,
It seems endless, the possibilities.
endless possibility.
But I'm thinking about technology and cognitive overload.
Yes.
Seems like that could be a problem too.
It can be if we're not careful.
And some of the web pages talk about how to use technology thoughtfully.
Yeah.
So it's not just about having all the shiny tools.
Right.
It's about using them in a way that doesn't overload the learner.
That's right.
So what are some tips from the sources on how to do that?
Well, one key principle is understanding how we process information
Oh, okay.
through different channels. So we know from multimedia learning theory
Yeah.
that our brains handle visual and auditory input differently.
Okay.
So a long text-heavy presentation
Yeah.
is likely to overwhelm working memory.
Yeah. I've definitely been in those
Right.
death by PowerPoint,
Exactly.
whereas a concise presentation with visuals and narration
Yeah.
might be much more effective.
Much more effective.
So it's about striking that balance
Yes.
between the different modes.
Finding that balance.
I'm sure there are some specific tips in the sources
There are, yeah.
on how to do that.
So one tip is to integrate text directly into diagrams
Oh,
rather than separating them.
okay. So that split attention thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another tip is to use short videos and screencasts
Uh-huh.
instead of lengthy lectures,
Okay.
and then avoid unnecessary animations or distractions.
Right. Things that hijack attention.
Right.
Yeah.
Just keep it clean and simple.
Yeah. I love that idea of embedding the text within the visuals.
Yeah.
That just makes so much sense from a cognitive load perspective.
Yeah. It just streamlines the information flow.
Removes those mental hurdles.
Exactly.
We've talked a lot about minimizing cognitive overload.
We have.
But what about strategies for maximizing germane load?
Right. So that's where those higher order learning strategies come in.
Okay.
We want learners to actively engage with the material.
Yeah.
So we want to encourage them to ask questions, make connections to prior knowledge,
Uh-huh.
summarize information in their own words,
Yeah.
and even teach concepts to others.
Oh, I always find that when I have to teach something,
Yes.
that's when I really learn it.
It forces you to think about it in new ways
Yeah.
and anticipate those questions.
Yeah, and it seems like curiosity and exploration also play a crucial role in that
They do.
maximizing germane load.
They do.
When learners are interested in a topic,
Yes.
they're more likely to engage in those deeper learning strategies.
They are. They're driven by that intrinsic motivation
Mm.
to understand and to make those connections.
But what about those learners who maybe just aren't naturally curious
Right.
about a particular topic?
Yeah. How do we spark that initial interest?
Yeah. How do we help them see the relevance of what they're learning?
So that's where I think the educator's creativity and adaptability really come into play.
Okay.
Finding ways to connect the learning to students' interests,
Okay.
showing them the real world applications of what they're learning.
Yeah.
So instead of just presenting a formula in isolation,
Yeah.
we might show how it's used in engineering or architecture or even video game design.
Right. So they can connect to their own lives.
Exactly.
And that might involve incorporating different teaching methods,
Yes.
telling stories,
Bringing in guest speakers.
bringing the learning outside the classroom.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like you have to be flexible
We do.
and experiment
Yeah.
to find what resonates.
We're not just filling empty vessels.
Yeah.
We're trying to ignite a passion for learning.
I love that.
You know?
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm wondering about assessment.
Right.
It seems like a tricky area when we're considering cognitive load.
It is.
We need to assess learning,
Yeah,
but the assessments themselves can introduce cognitive overload.
absolutely.
So how do we assess learning
Yeah,
without creating unnecessary cognitive burden for our students?
that is the question.
Yeah, and I'm especially curious about, how we can apply these principles of cognitive load theory to make assessments more effective
Right.
and less stressful.
Less stressful.
Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah,
We don't want students to be afraid of assessments.
right.
So assessment is this vital part of the learning process,
Mhm.
but it can also introduce a whole new set of cognitive demands, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
So the key is to design assessments that accurately measure learning
Okay.
without adding extraneous load.
Right, we don't want to make it harder than it needs to be.
It's about finding that sweet spot where the assessment challenges students to think critically
Uh-huh.
and apply their knowledge,
Right.
but not to the point where they become overwhelmed.
So it's like mental weightlifting.
It is like mental weightlifting.
You want them to feel the burn,
Yeah,
but not get crushed by the weight.
that's a great analogy.
Are there specific tips in our sources on how to design those kinds of assessments?
There are.
Okay.
So the first principle is alignment.
Alignment.
Yes.
Okay.
So a well-designed assessment should be tightly aligned with the learning objectives.
Okay, so it's focused on.
It's focused on the key concepts
Yeah,
and skills that were emphasized during instruction.
makes sense.
And this helps to reduce extraneous load by ensuring that students aren't bombarded with irrelevant information
Okay.
or tricked by questions that focus on really obscure details.
So it's like training for a marathon.
It is like training for a marathon.
Yeah.
You wouldn't spend your time practicing sprints or lifting heavy weights.
Right, you'd focus on endurance.
Yeah, exactly. You'd focus on building that endurance and stamina.
Yeah.
The same principle applies to assessment.
I like that analogy. That makes a lot of sense.
So it's not just about what we assess,
Uh-huh.
it's also about how we assess it,
Right.
the format of the assessment itself.
Yeah, does that play a role?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
The format can have a significant impact on cognitive load.
Okay.
Remember the split attention effect we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
If we design an assessment that requires students to constantly switch their attention between different sources of information,
Yeah.
we're just introducing unnecessary extraneous load.
So like a multiple choice test where the questions are on one page
Right.
and the diagram is on another?
That's a bad idea.
Yeah.
A better approach would be to integrate those elements as much as possible.
Okay.
For example, you can embed the questions directly within the diagram,
Yeah.
or use interactive software that allows students to manipulate the visual elements while answering questions.
Okay, so it's about making the assessment as streamlined as possible.
Streamlined and intuitive.
Removing those cognitive speed bumps.
Exactly.
Are there any other formatting tips?
Well, sometimes an oral assessment can be more effective than a written test,
Okay.
especially for subjects that involve a lot of practical application.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you're teaching a coding class,
Yeah.
having students actually write and debug code
Right.
might be a more accurate assessment of their skills.
So then answering multiple choice questions about coding.
Exactly. We
Yeah.
want to assess their ability to actually do the thing,
Right. Not just regurgitate facts.
not just memorize facts.
Yeah.
We want to see them apply that knowledge.
Okay, so we've talked about alignment, we've talked about format.
Uh-huh.
What about the difficulty level?
That's a great question.
How do we make it challenging but not overwhelming?
Right. So that's where the expertise level of the learners comes into play.
Okay.
Novices, those who are just starting out, they might benefit from more structured assessments
Okay.
with clear guidance and support.
So maybe like hints or partially worked solutions?
Exactly. Or
Okay.
even opportunities to collaborate with their peers.
So it's about giving them enough scaffolding
Yes.
to reduce that cognitive load.
You reduce the cognitive load, but still allow them to stretch their abilities.
It's like those completion problems again.
It is like those completion problems,
Yeah.
providing just enough support,
Yeah.
but leaving room for them to make those connections.
And then as learners gain more expertise,
Yes.
we can gradually.
We can gradually increase that complexity,
Okay.
require more problem solving, more critical thinking, more independent work.
Yeah.
It's about that gradual ramp up in difficulty.
So we want them to be challenged but not defeated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to find that sweet spot.
And that's where formative assessment comes in.
Absolutely.
Those check-ins throughout the learning process
Yeah.
to see where students are at.
Exactly. So a formative assessment can take many forms.
Okay.
Low stakes quizzes,
Mhm.
in-class discussions, observations of student work,
Uh-huh.
or even just quick pulse checks
Okay.
to see where students are struggling.
Yeah.
The key is to use these assessments as a tool for learning, not just grading.
Right. So we're identifying misconceptions early on.
Yes.
And we can provide that support.
Provide targeted support
Yeah.
before those misconceptions become entrenched.
It's like those course correction maneuvers you make when you're navigating a ship.
It is.
You got to make small adjustments along the way.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you end up miles off course.
A great analogy.
And formative assessment can also help to foster that growth mindset.
Yeah.
Helping learners see that mistakes are opportunities for learning.
Yes. Mistakes are part of the process.
Yeah, not failures.
Exactly.
And it seems like that personalized approach can also extend to summative assessment,
Absolutely.
those higher stakes ones,
Right.
at the end of a unit or a course.
So consider offering choices. Okay. In how students demonstrate their understanding.
Okay.
Allow them to choose between a traditional test, a project, a presentation, or even a creative piece.
Okay, so we're giving them options
We're giving them options.
to showcase their learning in a way that feels authentic to them.
Yeah.
So assessment shouldn't be an afterthought.
It shouldn't.
It should be woven into the fabric of the learning experience.
Yes.
And it should be designed to minimize extraneous load
Yes.
and maximize opportunities for learning.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive.
It had.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of cognitive load theory
I'm so glad to hear that.
and how it can be applied to make learning more effective.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Thank you for sharing your expertise.
You're welcome.
I'm left with a sense of empowerment.
Mhm.
Understanding these principles
Yeah.
gives us this powerful framework for making learning more effective,
It
more
does.
engaging, and ultimately more joyful.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing both the incredible potential
Yeah.
and the limitations of the human mind
Uh-huh.
and working within those constraints
Yeah.
to create learning experiences that truly nourish and inspire.
That's a perfect note to end on.
It is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we encourage you to explore these ideas further.
Yes.
Apply what you've learned to your own learning journey
Absolutely.
or your teaching practice.
And until next time,
Yeah.
keep those
Ah,
cognitive loads balanced.
I like that.
Okay.
All right, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
So we've talked a lot about building those schemas and getting that information into long-term memory,
Right.
but the sources also emphasize explicit instruction.
Yeah.